Hello, I'm Mandy Priest and I have been a volunteer working in hospices and hospitals, supporting patients and their families at the end of life for many years. And I now train other volunteers to do the same role. And I'm really passionate about the power of everyday listening, a gift that we all have, something we can all offer. But when I started end of life volunteering, I realised that the role was quite unique. The role meant that I couldn't be doing professional listening because I wasn't qualified to do that. I wasn't a therapist or a counsellor, so I had to find out what it was that I could offer, and indeed what we can all offer as volunteers or as friends, supporting our families and our communities. And the thing I discovered was the power and gift of being alongside someone and what that means. And I call it being rock, being there, supporting someone in the moment, being alongside. So being rock is a way in which we can frame our everyday listening. And it's the idea that when somebody is chatting to you and suddenly they begin to share a bit more deeply with you, then you have that instinct, that understanding to know, oh, hey ho, this is a rock moment now. And I have to be more present. I have to be rock, steady, safe, confidential, reassuring person who is alongside someone when they need it most. And the biggest gift that we can give someone is to listen so they feel heard. So there are a few essential elements I discovered to being rock. And the first one is presence. Now, I thought I kind of knew what presence was when you're being a listener, that you should lean forward and make eye contact. And the problem with that for me in my role was nobody was expecting me to be a listener. They were expecting me to just be a person who's visiting and sitting alongside another person. So I had to reframe what presence was in the everyday. And presence in the everyday is when we're just being authentically ourselves. And whether we're doing that on the telephone or whether we're doing that face to face, it's being able to hold that idea of right now I'm being rock for someone and I'm going to embrace being quiet when needed. And I'm going to embrace that idea of being steady and still so that somebody can bash and crash against me and I'm still going to be there being their rock. Now, obviously, if you're doing that on the phone, then you need to indicate your presence with your voice. And I would say that we will do that just by doing or occasionally. But please be careful that you don't do that quite a lot because it can sound like you're hurrying somebody along. But also it's finding that balance because you don't want to be so quiet that they wonder if you're not actually there. If you're doing it face to face, I actually find it's easier to be alongside rather than face to face because again, they're not expecting you to be their professional listener. And so it can be very nice to be able to sit next to somebody side by side, looking at a view and giving them the space to just chat away. And yes, make eye contact, but also it's okay not to. Sometimes when people are feeling very vulnerable, it's easier to share that vulnerability while they're not being watched. And that was a big learning for me. Please be you, be absolutely authentically you. Another mistake that I made was I was trying really hard to be a listener and that wasn't really working because again I was being too intense. We have to be as natural as possible, and that's a big part of this idea of I'm being a rock, and rocks have fissures and cracks and have had life in them, and they have been worn by life, and people will choose you to be their rock because of that. So it's really important that you are who you are. It's a great gift. Now, all of this idea came about as I started to observe people in hospitals. I was watching nurses and seeing who were the ones that people talk to and why, and realizing that certain things that people did made a big difference. So presence is one of them. And the other thing that makes a big difference is being aware of people's body language and how they talk to each other. And obviously, if you're supporting somebody on the phone, you lose body language. So I'm going to share with you today some sort of ideas around how people talk when things are troubling them. So I noticed that people were responding in sort of inward and outward body language and inward and outward speech. So I'll describe that to you. So inward is, I'm really troubled. I've got something really weighing on me, and I'm going to close in my body language and not make eye contact with you because everything is crashing in. But what's really interesting about people who are in inward is that they also speak inward. So if they're on the phone, you could still pick up that they're inward by their intonation and the way they speak. So inward tends to be, I feel troubled, I feel sad, it's all about how they feel inside. It's inward emotion. And also, they try and, because they're inward, they're hiding almost to themselves how they're feeling. They tend to hide what's really bothering them in amongst the conversation. And I call that the drop. So there will be moments where they will be speaking to you and then they will drop into the conversation what's really bothering them. So if I give you an example, they might say something like, yes, I've had a really lovely day today, but I have been feeling quite lonely, but it's been a lovely sunny day. So in between those two nice bits of conversation was, I've been feeling really lonely. And that drop is a really good indication of what is really going on for them. So that's inward. And then there's outward. Outward is very different. Outward isn't about how I feel in terms of internally. Outward is the experience I'm having because of somebody else or something else. So they did that, this has happened. It's quite large and big and bold and can come across quite almost a bit aggressive. So outward is, my GP promised to phone me back and they haven't phoned me back when they said they were going to. Understandable, we're all under pressure right now as I'm filming this. But it's that sort of thing. It's when something impacts from outside. And it tends to cause a very different way of speaking. People tend to be quite ranty, and it's quite sort of verbally fast and edgy. Anybody who knows somebody who rants regularly will know that coming in on a rant and trying to stop it is not a great idea. It doesn't really work. So I would suggest that we watch out, we hear a rant and then watch out for when somebody has finished their rant. And they normally come back with a way of letting you know that they're done. I call it the return. So people rant and then they return. So a return might be, oh, I didn't realise I was that cross, or oh, glad to get that off my chest, that sort of thing. So that is inward and outward body language, or inward and outward speech. So observing that as rocks enables us to move on to the next sort of part of the frame of being a rock, which is about how we then enable someone to feel heard. And the best way I've found about doing that is to reflect, either to reflect the word that they've said in their drop, or possibly to reflect our willingness to be alongside and stay and listen regardless of the situation, like we carry on listening to a rant. If we do reflect a drop, my top sort of advice on that is to make it very subtle. So you could be saying on the phone, you know, okay, you know, those sort of soft words, and then say the person said lonely and you've noticed they've said that a few times, then you could just say lonely, but don't make a big deal about it. If you're face to face with somebody, there's a big difference between saying lonely or lonely, because now you've made a big thing about it. And if you make a big thing about it when somebody's feeling very vulnerable, that kind of shuts them down. Whereas if you just say the word very softly, almost like you're saying then what happens is you are giving somebody the opportunity to hear themselves through you, and that can be very, very powerful. If they don't ever respond to your reflection of a drop, that doesn't matter, because at the very least you know that subconsciously they will feel heard. You have spotted their drop and reflected it to them, and it's a gift. Try and keep your, after you've reflected a drop, make sure that you hold silence for a little bit, because it's really important to give people the space to hear your reflection. If somebody asks you a difficult question, I always find, especially questions that begin with "do you," those sort of questions quite often I see as gambits, and that the gambit is more, I'd like to explore that topic with you, and are you willing to stay alongside and listen? So, you know, a possible one could be, end of life could be, do you believe in an afterlife? Do you believe in heaven? And what I would normally reflect back is my willingness to listen. So I would say something like, oh, is that something that you've been thinking about a lot? Would you like to tell me about your thoughts? So that you're giving someone the opportunity to ponder things through with you. If they ask you a specific question, like, will I be in pain when I die, which is completely above your pay grade as a friend, family member, community member, or a volunteer, then obviously you can then say very honestly, wow, I don't think I can answer that question, but I would be really happy to support you to try and find someone who can. Okay? So we shouldn't feel that we have to be all things. In fact, I think it's really important that we're not all things. There are an incredible array of amazing professionals out there right now who can support, and it's just knowing how to enable somebody to find that support. Okay, so that's reflecting, and then that takes us on to empathy. Now, empathy, I thought I knew what that was, but one of the things I learned very early on was that there was something getting in the way of me being able to be truly empathetic, and that was what I call my rock gremlin. And it turns out lots of us have rock gremlins. I think everybody has rock gremlins, and what I mean by that is we have learned, probably from being little and watching people around us, how to respond automatically to somebody who is in a tricky situation. And what we do is, if somebody says, for instance, I have been diagnosed with, and your brain goes, wow, I don't know how to respond to that, we come out with a default response. And our default response might be a fix-it response. I have a big fix-it gremlin. So it might be something like, oh, I'm sure you'll be okay. I'm sure that, you know, everything will be fine. Or we'll offer solutions, or have you tried this? Have you tried that? I'm sure that will make you better. Or we might use a bit of humour, or we might even, you know, really panic and not say anything because we just don't know what to say. Now, all of us have this within us. And I have to say that for the most part, these defaults aren't always wrong. You know, a bit of humour can really help. And sometimes we do need to offer solutions to people. However, being aware of what your gremlin is a really good thing in terms of listening, because it can be inappropriate, especially if you're supporting people around end of life, for you to try and immediately go into fix-it mode, especially if you're a volunteer or a friend or a family member, because you haven't got that experience. So in order to rock empathy, we have to know what our rock gremlin is and keep our gremlin in our back pocket and not let it out. I had to learn the hard way. Okay, so that brings us back to empathy then. And empathy, I thought I knew it. I thought, okay, empathy is imagining what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes and letting them know that we know what it's like to be in their shoes. The problem that I discovered is that there is a way to get that right and a way not to. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. A few days after my dad died, a friend of mine said, I know how you feel because I lost my horse last year. Now, my dear friend was doing beautiful empathy because she loved her horse and that was the only loss she'd ever had. So she was doing this beautiful empathy and sharing how she knew what it was like to be in my shoes. The problem was, in my raw state, I couldn't hear that empathy because I felt that she was comparing my loss of losing my mum to her loss of losing her horse over a year ago, and those two things did not relate. And it made me think very deeply about what empathy therefore is, and how by telling our story we can reduce the power of empathy. So I think I've come up with how we can get it to be more useful. So what if my friend had said this instead? I too have felt grief and I know how hard that is. Now she's not sharing her story other than she's saying, I've walked in those shoes. My experience of walking in those shoes are different. I'm not going to tell you about that, but I have walked in the shoes. That's empathy, because suddenly we have the impact of the situation in common, but we don't need to share our story behind it. What we want to do is listen to the person's experience of their loss at that moment. It's a long journey to getting all of this right. Sometimes it can feel like that. It can feel like, oh, I've got so many things now I have to think about being a listener that I don't know whether I can do that. What I discovered is people are not looking for you to be perfect. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for connection. And it's really, really important for you to know that you are enough. If someone has chosen you as their rock, then they already see you as that safe person they can share with. They already have chosen you. So you don't have to worry about getting everything right. All you have to do is try your best to be alongside. That's it, and that's the gift. So I hope that's given you some insights into a different way of being with somebody, to hold your presence, to observe whether they're inward or outward, to reflect when you need to, and to be alongside with empathy and show them that without getting the gremlin involved, you can be alongside and appreciate where they are. And if you can't possibly imagine what they're going through, can't even get yourself there, say so. Be honest. Say, I can't possibly imagine what you're going through because I've not had that experience, but I am willing to listen to you. I am willing to hear your story, because it's in the hearing, in the witnessing, that we can do our best work. Okay. I've written a book. It's called Being Rock. It's on Amazon if you want to explore this more deeply. I hope that this will give you the best support possible to start your listening journey if you're now thinking about being a volunteer or listening to any member of your family who is facing the ends of their lives. Take care, keep safe, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.